Hello, everyone. Welcome to our special event today, Western Colonialism Examined, organized by Archer, American Romanian Coalition for Human and Equal Rights. I'm Mihaela Campion, one of Archer's founders, and I have the honor and pleasure to introduce our special guests today. Douglas Mpondi is a professor and chair of the Department of Africana Studies at Metropolitan State University of Denver, where he teaches African politics and government, African history, African peoples and cultures, and research methods in Africana studies. He earned his PhD in Cultural Studies and MA in African Studies at Ohio University. Mpondi has a BA degree and a master degree in African languages and literature from the University of Zimbabwe. Cristina A. Bejan is a historian, theater artist, and poet who currently teaches history at Metropolitan State University of Denver. A Rhodes and Fulbright scholar, she has had fellowships at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Wilson Center, and Georgetown University. She has taught at 5 universities. Bejan received her master's and DPhil in modern history from the University of Oxford and her BA in philosophy with honors from Northwestern University, where she also studied theater. Welcome both, and thank you for accepting Archer's invitation to be here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Professor Mpondi, would you like to start by helping us understand Africa?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this forum. I'm very excited to be joining you. So to put Africa in context, Africa is a continent of 55 independent countries, almost 4 times the size of the United States, with over 2,000 languages. In terms of ethnicity, Africa is so diverse. You have a country like Nigeria or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has more than 200 ethnic groups and languages. And then a small country like Seychelles off the east coast of Africa with around 100,000 people, whilst Nigeria has around 200 million people. So it is a diverse continent and cannot be seen as a country, but a very large continent with more than 1 billion people.
So I would like to jump in. And before I ask the following question, I want to share with our audience that I had the good fortune of meeting Professor Mpondi my first semester teaching at MSU Denver. And I have been this past year teaching world history, and it was really, really important to me to invite faculty from Africana Studies. And it's our good fortune that Professor Mpondi agreed. And he was both semesters my students' favorite day of class. And so that is what inspired Mihaela and myself to organize this talk for the Archer audience, to try to hit on some of the points that really, really captivated my students during his visits. And so the next question is inspired by Professor Mpondi's biography. So he is from Zimbabwe, which is at the very southern east. I don't know if you can see the map very well, just above South Africa in Africa. And Professor Mpondi has seen the history of colonialism with his own eyes. And if he could maybe give some background as to growing up under colonialism, seeing independence, going to a mixed high school, and the steps he took from there, I think is a good place to start today.
Oh yeah, thank you, thank you. You're taking me back to my rural village now. Yeah, so growing up in Zimbabwe in the late 70s, Zimbabwe was still under the colonial rule of Britain. So in terms of education, most of our curricula was British oriented. We did a lot of British history, English literature. In fact, we knew more about Shakespeare, about Chaucer than African writers. We knew more about European history, European geography, American history. We knew more about the Mississippi than a stream that was across our school. So our curricula was meant to produce a very passive student who has to admire Western civilization. So when I was growing up in Zimbabwe, I went to, initially it was an all black school, but in high school, I went to a former group A school where there were a lot of white students. It was just after independence. So more than 50% of the students were still white. And it was difficult. It was a culture shock, in fact, for me to go to that school because I have never been to a school like that. And I was surprised to see how blessed they were in terms of textbooks, in terms of the classrooms themselves. But it was also a learning experience in terms of cultural grounding, cultural understanding. And that is when I began to understand the history of colonialism, because I was also majoring in history, but was now asking myself why we were doing more of European history than African history. So that's how I came to understand how European colonialism had affected our education system in terms of what was being taught in schools. I even majored in English literature. I knew more about European writers. I've already talked about Shakespeare, about Chaucer, about Dickens. We would memorize those verses from Macbeth, Julius Caesar, Merchant of Venice, but none from African writers. So that's when I began also to understand that education itself was meant to oppress the African. You are more oppressed when you are taught things that are not about you, but about other cultures.
And could I also just interject really quickly to talk about the moment of independence, right? 1980, correct? Is that correct, yeah. Professor Mpondi? Mm-hmm. So were you in high school at that moment?
No, not yet in high school. So when independence happened, I would say I was in Zimbabwe, they would say grade 3, which is, so I would say elementary school. But so when independence came, there was a lot of euphoria about independence, you know, that liberation had come, freedom had come, and we used to go 18 April 1980, that's when we had our independence. So every year, 18 April was celebrated as a year of liberation, a year of freedom. And things were still going on well as compared to what is happening right now in Zimbabwe. So yeah, so when independence came, it was a time to look back and think about the past and why and how African people were fighting for their liberation, which takes us to the history of colonialism in Africa, in terms of how European powers met in Berlin 1884 to 1885 to talk about the scramble for Africa. You know, no representatives from Africa were there in Berlin, but European powers were so eager to carve up the African continent so that they wanted to make sure that they do not fight over colonies in Africa. They wanted to share so that when they get to their spheres of influence, there was going to be less conflict. Remember what was happening in Europe during that time in the 1880s? There was the Franco-Prussian War where France lost to Germany. And so the British also came in and said to France, if you can be a friend to us in Africa, then we'll make sure that we'll be a friend against Germany. So there were also alliances that were forged in terms of carving up the African continent. And if you look at even the First World War in 1914, during that period, I think those of you who have had some European history, from 1870 to 1914, in Europe, it was referred to as a period of armed peace. Most European powers were armed, but there was no war. So it only happened with the Sarajevo assassination, and it sparked the war. But Europe was already in a bellicose mood. Europe was ready for war. Even the general population was waving soldiers when they were leaving for war. So people were like, they were ready to go to war. And I remember also reading about Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, 1917, when he said that the First World War was an imperial war. It was a war to fight for colonies in Africa, in Latin America, and Asia. So you think a lot about how the European countries were led by Germany through Otto von Bismarck to have the Berlin Conference. And Germany initially said they didn't want colonies in Africa. Yeah, Bismarck was saying, my Africa is in Europe, because Germany was the strongest European power during that time. So they were saying, our focus is on Europe, not in Africa. But because the conference was held in Berlin, Germany ended up taking colonies in Africa, which were repossessed after the First World War, because Germany was blamed for the outbreak of war in 1914. So colonies like Togo, Cameroon, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Namibia were under German colonialism during that time, but they were repossessed after World War I, because Germany was blamed for the outbreak of war at the Versailles Conference in 1919.
If I can step in for a moment, what was very interesting to learn was that there were no African dignitaries present at the conference. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, because the main reason for colonizing Africa was imperial. It was more economic than the other reasons they talked about, that they wanted to bring Christianity, they wanted to civilize Africans. And you begin to wonder, civilization started in Africa, and why would they go and civilize people who started with civilization? So you will see that the main reason was economic. Because of what I've already said in terms of how European countries were fighting amongst themselves, they needed more land and more markets outside of Europe. So Africa was an obvious inclusion in terms of also finding cheap labor. Remember, there was also slavery before that. So Europe had not forgotten about the potential they could find in Africa. So if you think about the geography or the geopolitics of colonialism, you see that most of the roads and railways were leading to the seas from the colonies. No railways or roads were meant to save Africans. They were meant to save the colonial system. So the issue of bringing civilization and Christianity were afterthoughts, but the main reason was imperialism. It was economic. Africa needed resources to sustain the Industrial Revolution. Remember, even the Industrial Revolution in Europe was successful because of slavery. Cheap labor, in fact, free labor from slavery. So it's not by coincidence that you see that when the Industrial Revolution in Europe and North America was taking place, that is the time that they were also having free labor from plantations using slaves.
Well, and Professor Mpondi, before we get into the pros and cons, because that's something that my students really enjoy debating coming out of your lectures, you mentioned Christianity and the civilizing mission. And so now we're talking about it this summer in particular, but we've been having this conversation for many years now in the United States, and that is the white savior complex. So, you know, white Americans going abroad on these kind of, you call them, you know, tourism missions where they build a school, they pay to build a school, and they believe that they're in this kind of savior role. So we clearly have not come out of that, unfortunately. And I was wondering if you could say something about how racism played into sustaining the colonial system in the 20th century.
Yeah, so that's a very good critical and instructive point. So racism, although it wasn't mentioned openly, was also one of the main issues in terms of African colonialism, that the African people were seen as backward. So they needed some kind of civilization from the Europeans, which is why I was saying that it's interesting that these people thought that they could civilize people who started with civilization, because Africa is the cradle of mankind. This is where the first human settlement was found. There is no evidence contrary to that. So in terms of civilization, it started in Africa, but Europeans thought that no, that was not enough. They needed to introduce something better, that the way of living that Africans were experiencing was not to their standards. So they wanted to enlighten them, you know. And so, yes, the issue of racism was part of that, because the Europeans saw themselves as superior and wanted to teach Africans how to live their way. That is why even the education system ended up teaching Africans about Europe, not about Africa itself. So this psychological oppression was even more far-reaching than physical oppression, because once you oppress the mind, it's difficult to decolonize that mind. It takes a long, long time, because once it's taught in schools, then it becomes, you know, the authority. Even think about the United States. We talk about Christopher Columbus discovering America, but there were already Native Americans living in America for thousands of years, but he discovered a country where people were already living there. The same in Africa, in Zimbabwe and Zambia, they talk about the Victoria Falls as having been discovered by Livingstone. But the local people already had a local name for the falls, Mose Atunya, smoke that thunders. But Europeans came and gave it the name of Queen Victoria, because it was discovered by Europeans. So
Right.
yeah. It reminds me also what Frantz Fanon talks about in terms of the psychology of oppression, that once the locals are taught to admire a foreign culture, they will think that anything from outside is better than local things, which is what happened during the colonial period, because most of what was taught in schools was about Europe, was about Britain, was about France. We knew more about English literature, English history than local history. So once you admire a foreign culture, then it becomes the norm. You even despise your own culture.
Yeah, and the way you expressed it in terms of psychological oppression and this oppressing the mind, which links to something you said earlier, which is top of my list to talk about today. We got here a little more quickly than I anticipated, but we should talk about it now, and then we're going to return to pros and cons. And that is decolonizing education. That is something that Professor Mpondi inspired me greatly this year to talk to my students about. And the way he shared when he visited our classes, precisely what he said today, which is decolonize the mind. Let us get outside of these, European perspective limits, sources, and the storyteller, the European man being the storyteller who writes the history books. Let's get away from that. And we're finally in the United States actually engaging in this conversation in higher education of how we're going to decolonize our classrooms. And for me, as a history professor, what that looks like is really seeking out and including primary source material that is not written by a privileged white European man. And those sources really are there. And I found that my students are really, so far this year, they've really gravitated towards these perspectives, these stories that you might not have heard about until now in the American educational system. So that's what Decolonize Education is about. And Professor Mpondi, you set this up, you teed it up for me in terms of being able to explain right now in the American higher education context in terms of this effort to decolonize, which of course we're having more of a conversation because of George Floyd's death this summer, and people awakening to the need that we do need to actually look critically at how we teach history. But I do want to include the discussion about pros and cons, because I think that I don't want to assume anything here with our audience, but I think that we all have a lot of empathy in our hearts and can see the cons that you've highlighted so far, Professor Mpondi. But when some people come forward and say, but hey, colonialism wasn't all bad, which is something I've heard in my education, people coming from other spheres of colonial influence. I'm not going to go into too many details, but ones that are often given as examples are infrastructure, hospitals, roads, airports, and education, which you've already so eloquently described as being highly problematic. So could you just say a little bit about those who do argue that there were benefits and pros to Westernization, to Western colonization, in the African case, of course?
Oh, thank you. That's very important. And even before I talk about the pros from colonialism, I'm thinking of something that I overlooked in terms of the artificial borders that were created by colonialism. So Africa's map right now is a colonial map because it was drawn by Europeans. And we have a lot of border conflicts, issues that came as a result of the borders that were drawn by Europeans, which brought together people who used to be in conflict were now belonging to the same state. And it also broke up families because they drew their borders arbitrarily. So I can give you a case of Zimbabwe and Mozambique, for example. In Eastern Zimbabwe, when you cross the border into Mozambique, you will still hear people speaking Shona, which is spoken in Zimbabwe. And you begin to wonder, why is this happening? It is because of that artificial border. So these people who speak the same language, whether they cross into Zimbabwe or into Mozambique, culturally, they are the same. But instead, in terms of statehood, they belong to two different states with different rules and requirements. But they are the same people in terms of culture. I think Mexico and America would also be a good example. When you cross the border into Mexico, and let's say you're in California or in Texas and you hear people speaking Spanish, it is difficult to draw a line where it starts and ends because it's a cultural relationship. But in terms of statehood, if you're an American and you cross into Mexico, then you have to follow the Mexican rules, Mexican laws. If you're a Mexican and you cross into America, then you have to follow the American rules. So what I'm trying to say is that these artificial borders are a colonial creation. So modern states, whatever you think about, were created as a result of conquest, as a result of colonialism. But going back to the argument that but Africa benefited from infrastructure, from education, from roads and railways, I would argue that those infrastructure and roads and education were meant to serve the colonial system. That was their main role. They were not meant to serve Africans. They were meant to sustain the colonial system. The fact that they remained after the liberation struggle was coincidental, but they were not even meant to serve the Africans. They even created problems because when the Europeans left, Africans were not able to use them because they were not meant for them. Those are the problems. The colonial legacy, I would say, is a big problem in a lot of African countries, especially when you think about education, because the education was meant to save the colonial system. That is why we were learning more about Europe than about Africa. So yes, we can talk about the pros that we had airports, but those airports were not meant for Africans to visit each other. Those airports were meant to transport resources from Africa to Europe. When you look at the roads, the infrastructure, most of them were going to the sea because it was all about exporting them from Africa to Europe. There were no roads or railways that were built so that Africans could just visit each other. You know, there wasn't that luxury. It was all about business. So yes, we've had those infrastructures and roads, but they didn't save the Africans. Mostly they were saving the colonial system. That they were left after the colonial period, yes, because they were there to save a colonial system, to sustain a colonial system. Even when we think about agriculture, for example, a country like Zimbabwe ending up being a one-crop economy because they wanted tobacco to export to Europe. People would starve because they couldn't grow maize, they couldn't grow corn to feed themselves. They had to grow tobacco because that was the crop for profit. So we might look at the pros that Africans needed, the infrastructure, but those were not meant for them. You know, think about somebody eating in a restaurant and then leave something for you to eat because you are hungry. You don't have a choice. You end up even going to the trash can to look if there's some food. That's how the system of colonialism worked.
I think that's very persuasive. Mihaela, do you want to chime in about the?
I need a deep breath.
Yeah.
Because of empathy. I would like to hear from you, Christina. How would you transport these concepts into Eastern Europe? If you have any thoughts about any similarities or a parallel between Western colonialism and what was happening in Eastern Europe?
Well, there are a number of parallels, but I think the one that's most obvious really is this, it really is the same word in the Romanian context, which is Westernization. And I'm going to point Romania out on this. I don't know how well you can see it. No, there's Europe. Romania is in the far corner down here in Europe. Because this debate about pros and cons and defining the Romanian identity, which I hope we get to actually unpack a little more before we finish today, it's all wrapped up in whether or not Romanians consider themselves Western looking versus Eastern looking. And this conversation began when Romania had her national awakening around the 1848 revolutions of Europe. And Wallachia and Moldova decided to join together and try to become, the Romanian state. Eventually, Transylvania joined to circle back to Professor Mpondi's excellent explanation of World War I. At the end of World War I, Transylvania was given to Romania as a war gain. But this debate about whether or not we should Westernize. In the 19th century, you have to consider that Romania mostly was like parts of Romania today, and poverty-stricken, incredibly rural, village life that many would argue doesn't even look what you might consider to be European, very, very rudimentary way of life. And it was the educated elite that went abroad, mostly to Paris, but to some other Western European cities, and brought political, philosophical ideas back to their homeland, and with the argument that Romania should be built as a nation on a Western model. So that's why Romania has a constitution that's modeled after the Belgian constitution. Her educational system is modeled, I mean, mostly, of course, it's different in Transylvania with the German and Hungarian influence, but you find most of the educational system modeled on the French. French was actually the language in the schools. In Professor Mpondi's point about what you're learning in schools, back in the day, Romanian education was really learning about France. And so there was a backlash to that. And there were high profile intellectuals, I mean, Nicolae Iorga being a very, very obvious example, but even before he rose to his prominence, people were arguing, well, this is a bad thing. We need to remain native to the Romanian substance. The indigenous was a word thrown around. Autochthon was a word thrown around. We need to be authentic to the earth, the Romanian earth, and to the traditions and the language that we have going on here, rather than bringing in these foreign Western forms. They were called forms. It was a form versus substance debate. So, I'm sure, most people would probably say, oh, Romania wasn't colonized by France. Romania was not an official colony of France. But when it comes to these ideas that came from France, they took hold, and the rejection of them is what led to the rise of fascism in Romania in the 1930s and the success of what then Romania became a fascist dictatorship and allied with Hitler. And after that, we all know it came communism, and that was bad as well. So, so this debate actually kind of ignited bad decisions that Romania made in the 20th century. This debate did not start in Romania. Actually, the first place European location where people were really talking about this was in Russia. And there it was the Westernizers bringing in the French ideas versus the Slavophiles. We are a Slavic people. This is something we talked about in the last Archer conference with Professor Marius Turda. The idea of race in Europe has really changed since these conversations were going on, and people viewed themselves as, if they were Slavophile, that meant that they were racially distinct from these Westerners bringing in these foreign, inauthentic ideas. And clothing, that's another one. So that's a very famous one in the Russian case. But so that, and then we see it play out today with Romania now finally being part of the European Union. Yet there is this very powerful faction in Romania that is still looking eastward, that is rejecting these Western, and along with Western, we have democratic ideas, and wanting a Putin-inspired solution, wanting to remain under Putin's sphere of influence. And so Romania always has been at this colonial crossroads between the West and the East. And that's part of why I think she's so unique and interesting, but it means that she's been given a rough hand throughout history. So that's how Westernization plays in. Another thing that we mentioned when Mihaela, you and I spoke yesterday, was this concept of nationalism. And I think that this ties beautifully back to the way Professor Mpondi explained, because I think it's hard, we kind of take nation states for granted. Nations existed when we were born, therefore they are the nations. It wasn't so simple at all. The nation states in Africa were, those borders were drawn by the colonial powers. They did not represent the authentic communities that lived within those borders, as Professor Mpondi explained. And so now we have problems of nationalism playing out, in a very dangerous way. I mean, genocide is not unique to Europe. We have cases of genocide in Africa over these border disputes and language and ethnicity disputes. And also nationalism, again, same story in Europe, rising again in a very dangerous way, in terms of the rise of neo-Nazi parties in parliament in Italy, and Germany, but across the continent of Europe, not just those two countries. And so that now in the 21st century, we have a question of nationalism. What do we do with it, even though it's inauthentic in many places to the actual people who live within the nations? And democracy, is democracy a viable political system? This westernized democracy that we're all taking for granted, is that viable? So I'm going to pass the baton off to Professor Mpondi. Do you have anything to contribute to that in terms of nationalism and democracy in Africa?
It goes back to the European nature of African states, you know, that in terms of their creation, these are creations from Europe. Like I was saying, before the Europeans came, there were kingdoms that didn't have the borders that were created by Europe, in terms of them being so defined in terms of spheres of influence. So I think that is why we have a lot of problems in democratic transitions in Africa, especially with the winners take all mentality, which wasn't the system in the pre-colonial kingdoms. So you find that people are contesting for power, and when they lose, it's difficult to accept because democracy is a culture. So I think even when you think about how American democracy has been exported to other countries and how it has not worked, examples are Iraq and Egypt, where elections were held the American way, but just after the elections, there is violence going on, and you begin to wonder, what is the problem? The problem is that it's something that is imported from outside and doesn't align with the cultures of those people. So it's difficult for it to work the way it works in Europe. But you will see that even after independence, European powers still wanted to control these African colonies in terms of who should be the leader. That is why you see, if there's a problem in Mali, for example, the French are the first to be there. If there's a problem in Zimbabwe, the British are the first to be there. The same if there's a problem in Mozambique or Angola, the Portuguese are the first to be there, because they still have the interests that started during the colonial period. So even if these African countries have independence, there is now this neo-colonial control that comes through even international institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. You know, they come through the aid system that they want to help these countries solve some of the things they refer to as debt, for example. They say for you to eliminate your debt, you need to borrow more from IMF and World Bank. Mm. But this has led to underdevelopment in these countries. I'm thinking of water roadness, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and how this is continuing even up to today in terms of how these international monetary institutions are teaching African countries how to qualify for debt, because, you know, these loans have to be paid on a weekly basis. I'm thinking of Zimbabwe struggling to pay the billions that it owes from IMF and World Bank. So instead of developing these African countries through aid, it has even impoverished these countries. I'm sure you've heard of the Asian tigers and how they said no to aid. We're going to do things our own way. Because the aid that comes from IMF and World Bank has conditions. There are strings attached. It's a carrot and stick politics. You are given a carrot but told how to eat it. They bring in experts from these countries to make sure that the help they give you is spent the way they like. So even if it's education, then you are forced to buy books that have nothing to do with the development of your country. If it's coming from France, then it comes with equipment from that country. If it's coming from Britain, the same thing. So there's a new colonialism that is continuing in Africa through globalization, through even Chinese presence in Africa. You know, China is saying we want to do things differently from Europe, but it's the same thing, because you find China in countries that have minerals and oil, not in a haphazard manner. They know exactly where to go and when to benefit. And it has killed a lot of local industry, especially the textile industry, with substandard goods coming from Beijing. But China says, no, we are doing equal trade with African countries, but that's not the situation. A country like Zambia, for example, today is owned by China because it owes China a lot of debt. And there even talks that they are taking over the airport in Lusaka because Zambia is failing to pay back. So to me, it's Chinese imperialism in Africa. It's China's turn now to colonize the African continent. And you can also see that there is a Cold War going on between China and Europe and the United States in terms of controlling African resources.
Well, thank you so much for talking about colonialism in the 21st century, because that is really, I think it's hard for people, because colonialism has such a bad reputation in the 20th century, to actually see that we are living in an era of colonialism from all these different angles that you just mentioned, Professor Mpondi. Obviously, the United States, trying to impose democracy across the world, People's Republic of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and of course the domain of Western development, which I've gotten a taste of myself before I became an academic, and it is truly frightening in my humble opinion. So I'm really glad that we covered that. Mihaela, do you want to weigh in for a second?
Yes, for sure. Thank you. It's so helpful and informative to revisit some of these truths, and also to bring them back into the authenticity of the 21st century. I would like to ask Professor Mpondi about identity. It's something that it's such a hot topic. We discuss it at Archer in our organization. I spoke with Cristina yesterday a little bit about it, and we would like to hear more from you in terms of how does it feel for people who were, born in Africa, of European descendant, and also how can we address it in a way that it's non-offensive, I would say, when we speak with someone who is different. This was a conversation that we had, an ongoing conversation that we had, how to call someone. Is it okay to call African American? Is it okay to call a person Black? I mean, what would be the most non-offensive human way of addressing another human?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. Maybe I would say, before I explain, I would say, if you want to know somebody that you don't know, then maybe you can ask them who they are. It's easier that way than to assume that they belong to a certain group when they don't. I've had so many cases. I've been in the US for 20 years now, and I've been given so many identities. Are you from Ghana? Are you Nigerian? Are you from the Caribbean? And so you think about it and then say, oh, so when people look at me, they have in their mind where I already come from without even asking me who I am. So when I talk about issues of identity, identities are fluid, they are not fixed. So when you talk about a person of European descent who is born in Africa and consider themselves African, that's how they want to define themselves. Because let's not forget that location is also important when you talk about identity. So I'm talking about Zimbabwe, which had the history of white colonial settler colonialism, where a lot of Europeans came to settle in Zimbabwe. The same with South Africa, with Namibia, with Kenya. So a good example is during the Olympic Games in Moscow in 1980, Zimbabwe won gold in hockey with an all-white team. That was how it was. And even today, the few gold medals we have in Zimbabwe is from a white girl who is now the Minister of Education, Minister of Sports, Kirsty Coventry, for those who follow the Olympics. She's white and now she's the Minister of Sports because of her medals that she won during the Olympics. So I think where somebody is born is very important in terms of defining who they are. Like I said earlier, that I went to a mixed school in Zimbabwe where those students saw themselves as Zimbabwean. Not just because they are white, you would think they can fit in any white society. It's not easy. Bring them to the US and they are strangers because they might only be knowing about Zimbabwe because that's where they were born, that's where they grew up. So when you talk about identity in cultural terms, it's not just about skin color. It is mainly about culture and where these people identify and where they grow up and who they associate with. So identities, like I said earlier, they are very fluid. They are not fixed. They can change anytime in terms of your experiences, in terms of travel. But growing up in Zimbabwe, I know a lot of white people who are proud to call themselves Zimbabwean. But when we look at them, we would say, oh, they are Europeans. Take them to England, they are strangers because they didn't, even though their ancestors might be from England, but all they have known is about Zimbabwe. It's about South Africa. So I think there is a legitimate reason for them to identify them as African in terms of their experience because that's all what they know. We can't define them or give them an identity that is not theirs because that's what they feel because they grew up in that society. And it's interesting, if you go to Zimbabwe, there are quite a number of white people who speak the local language and you'll be surprised how they fit into that society because that is the society they understand. And even with the land reform program in Zimbabwe, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about how white farmers were chased away from Zimbabwe by the Mugabe administration. That was home for them because they were born in Zimbabwe, grew up in Zimbabwe, attended school in Zimbabwe, and culturally, that's where they belong. So I would say it's difficult today to look at the African continent as just Black or, people who are homogeneous. No, it's so mixed and diverse. And even you'll be surprised in terms of mixed marriages too. People have come to accept their world, and in a global world, identities are changing. And we see it even in politics in America with former President Obama, people asking, is America ready for a Black president? Or even asking if Barack Obama is truly American. He was born here and is American. Take him to Kenya, he's a visitor. It's it's foreign. So it's the same with white people born in African countries. They see themselves belonging to those countries. But politically, when politicians want to make cheap political points, then they refer back to their ancestors in terms of how they came to the African continent and that they don't belong. But for them, they see themselves as belonging to those countries because they were born there, they grew up there, they went to school in those countries. It's the only place that they know.
Thank you.
And then maybe going back to also the issue of African American and Black. It's only when I came to the United States for graduate school when I started realizing that I'm African, because that's when I was being asked about it. When I was back home, that question didn't come up because I was among my people. So it wasn't a big issue. But when I came, you would think that people think I know about all what's happening on the African continent. 55 countries, there is no way I would know about what's happening throughout the African continent. And even thinking about how big the African continent is, thinking about, say, Senegal and Zimbabwe. And I'm sure if you're coming from Washington, D.C., you would get to Senegal first before somebody who is leaving Senegal for Zimbabwe reaches his or her destination. So the African continent is so huge that it's not even possible to know everything. Even when I teach an intro to Africa course, it's difficult to cover everything because there are a lot of things to talk about. But going back to the question of identity, identities are so fluid and always changing. They are not fixed.
Thank you. Christina, would you like to add anything to this question?
Well, I love what Professor Mpondi shared in terms of we should feel free to ask people who they are and to this. You mentioned Washington, D.C., Professor Mpondi. I spent a little too much time there. And the question is always, what do you do? Rather than, what do you like to do? Or who are you? Or where were you born? Where are you from? Nobody cares about any of that stuff. So I think that just as, definitely in the United States, we need to shift society and culture in the direction of who are you? Define yourself. What makes you tick? What do you like? And that has to do with ethnic, racial, linguistic identity, but it also has to do with your dimensions as a human being. And I think the older I get, the more I feel that I am going to be unapologetically myself in all of my dimensions, even if they're complicated and American and Romanian and now Coloradoan. So I agree. And with fluidity comes being flexible and open-minded. And even this past week, I've seen a lot of people who express themselves on social media. It's my way or the highway. And that's not going to get us anywhere as a society. We need to be able to listen, have empathy, change our vocabulary, maybe even change our point of view in order to create a better world. And I know that's very idealistic, but.
We do our best. We do our best for that.
Yeah.
To just add on what Christina said, especially with what is going on globally with protests on systemic racism, it has been so inspiring to see that people from diverse backgrounds are coming together to fight for, racial equality or cultural tolerance or cultural awareness. I've heard somebody that I met and then said, I can't pick your accent. Where exactly are you from? So that question, when it comes to you, you're like, oh, then I'm sounding different. I'm sounding not belonging here. And somebody is trying to say they know where I come from, but why can't they just ask directly, Because we all have accents. When somebody says you have an accent, sometimes it's offensive because you're like, oh, they want me to speak like them, or, I'm not in the, majority. So there are a lot of things that come into play in terms of identities, especially in terms of trying to know other people. It doesn't kill you if you just ask somebody politely where they come from in terms of trying to understand them. But the problem comes when we assume we know when we don't know.
Very true. I get that question, by the way, all the time. So I'm very used to the feeling. And I try to understand where it's coming from on the other side. Why do people ask? I'm curious. Why do you ask where I'm from? because that's how we connect, I think. If we find out about each other and share our stories, that's a way of connecting. Thank you so much to both of you. This was absolutely amazing. And Archer is, expressing gratitude for your presence here today. And I would like to take a quick look and see if we have any questions or comments that you would like to hear as well. We have a comment here from someone who says that is a white Zimbabwean moving to America, and was a huge cultural shock for me, and Americans did not understand why I found American culture strange and foreign. So that's pretty much as you describe it, Professor Mpondi, similar comment. We also have a question here. Would love to know of African authors with English translations available. Christina, would you be able to say a few words, or would you like to answer this question in writing maybe on the
well, I was thinking of, because I've been taking notes, so I was thinking of sharing thoughts, but I can also share resources. I shared on Archer just 24 hours ago, a dear friend of mine who wrote a novel about the Nigerian American experience. And he's actually quite an accomplished author. He won I don't remember the name of the prize, but the prize for African literature. He was the first person of African descent not born in Africa to win this prize. So I'll share Topay's book again, but I will also share some other ideas. And Professor Mpondi, I am sure you have more insight into this than I do.
Yeah, I'm thinking of well-known African writers whose works have been translated into other languages, like Chinua Achebe from Nigeria with his Things Fall Apart. I know it has been translated into so many languages. Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya. He has written a lot of novels that were also in Kenyan languages, but translated to European languages like Germany, I think. We have a Zimbabwean writer called Tsitsi Dangarembwa. She wrote The Nervous Conditions, and I know it has been translated into other non-English European languages. And especially with the way that most of these books are now taught in European schools, you'll find a lot of African authors whose works have been translated to other languages. Especially African female writers have been so vocal in the past decade in terms of bringing up issues on the African continent. I'm thinking of the Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie. She wrote Americana. It's a very interesting book that talks about the African diaspora and their experiences. We also have a Zimbabwean female writer who was also educated in the United States. She wrote a book called Zenzele, A Letter from My Mother by Nozipho Maraire. So there are so many African authors whose works have been translated into European languages.
Thank you. That's very helpful to know. Any closing comments?
Well, I'll let Professor Mpondi have the final word. I would like to share that this has been such an honor. Thank you so much, Mihaela, for creating Archer and for inviting me to recommend people that I admire, such as Professor Mpondi, to come speak to us. And thank you, Professor Mpondi. My little piece of sadness going into this online teaching year is that I won't be able to invite you to come to my class in person. And also that I'm not teaching World this year, so I won't be able to invite you to come virtually. But I always learn so much from you, and I'm honored to be your colleague. So thank you so much for coming today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina and Mihaela, also for inviting me. When I saw the email from Christina, I was like, I don't think I can turn it down because I also enjoyed coming to your class and, you know, interacting with your students. I always look forward to that, especially speaking to other students that are not from your class. It's always interesting. So it was an honor for you to invite me to this conversation, and I really liked it. It refreshes some of the things that I'll be thinking about, but to hear it from other perspectives also helps me learn a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. It's been an honor for Archer and me personally. And I would like to ask everyone who watched live today, who were here with us today, if you have more questions or comments, feel free to continue to write them. Christina and myself will take a look and respond. And we are going to close today, and hopefully, you know, you'll join us in the future for other events. And again, thank you so much, Professor Mpondi and Cristina. And we wish you good luck in the new, you know, school year, starting soon. And keep us updated with more information about what's going on in the human's history. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.